Welcome to today's deep dive. Look, if you have ever stood at a glass display counter at your local sporting goods store,
Oh, I know exactly where you're going with this.
right, you're staring at two identical optics, and you're trying to decide between the red dot version or the green dot version.
Yeah, and for you listening, you know it feels like just a simple preference.
Exactly. You might assume it's exactly like picking out the paint color for a truck or choosing between a black or a tan rifle sling.
But the
But
debate is absolutely fierce.
it is. You see it on every message board, every single shooting range, every training class.
Right. It's one of those topics where everyone has a deeply held opinion, and they're usually convinced that their personal experience is the universal truth.
Always.
But as you dig into the mechanics of it, you realize the answer is beautifully complex. We aren't just comparing two different colored light bulbs here. We're dealing with human biology, environmental lighting conditions, and even a hefty dose of semiconductor physics.
Yeah, and the mission of our deep dive today is to bypass all of those anecdotal arguments. We want to rescue this from the brand loyalty and the internet forum shouting matches.
Definitely.
We are going to look at the hard biological science of human visual physiology. And to do that, we are pulling from a highly detailed breakdown titled Red Dot versus Green Dot. Which optic color is best and why?
Great piece of writing.
It really is. It was published by Valortech, which is a Florida-based training company, and authored by Herfel. He's an expert with a 30-year career steeped in practical excellence in firearms instruction.
And he brings this massive amount of real-world law enforcement experience to the table. But more importantly, he grounds all of his practical advice in clinical science.
Which is incredibly refreshing.
It is, because when you are talking about life-saving equipment or precision tools, you need to anchor the practical application in measurable reality. Understanding how the eye actually processes different wavelengths of light, well, it strips away the marketing hype.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the baseline science of how our eyes actually work when we step outside on a bright, sunny range day. The Valortech breakdown goes into heavy detail on something called photopic vision.
Right, and for you listening, photopic vision is just the clinical term for daylight vision.
Right.
When you're standing in the sun, your visual system relies entirely on cone cells. You have about 6 million of these cones packed into your retina.
6 million?
Yeah, and they're responsible for high-resolution detail and color perception. But here is the critical part that Herfel notes in the source. Those cones do not treat all colors equally.
They absolutely do not. Under those bright cone-dominant conditions, the human eye has a very specific spectral sensitivity curve.
Exactly. If you map it out, human vision peaks right at 555 nanometers on the visible light spectrum.
555 nanometers.
Yep. That specific wavelength hits the absolute sweet spot of our biological hardware. It means the eye requires the least amount of radiant energy to perceive it.
And 555 nanometers lands dead center in the green portion of the color spectrum.
It does.
So when you are standing out in high glare, bright sunlight, your eye is biologically hardwired to process green wavelengths far more efficiently than red.
Right, so if you have a red emitter and a green emitter, and they're pumping out the exact same milliwatt output of raw power.
Your brain will interpret the green dot as being significantly more intense.
Exactly. That biological efficiency translates into a massive usability advantage for the shooter.
How so?
Well, think about a high glare environment, like a sunny outdoor range with bright sand or maybe concrete reflecting light back up at you.
Yeah, that's brutal on the eyes.
It is. And you need your aiming point to be visually dominant so you can acquire it under recoil. Because green perfectly aligns with that 555 nanometer peak, your eye picks it up instantly without the diode having to work as hard.
The practical application of that is just huge. Because the green is perceived as brighter, you can run the optic on a much lower brightness setting.
Right.
The Valortech article highlights that when you turn an optic's brightness all the way up to maximum just to compete with the sun,
You get that bloom.
exactly, you introduce visual bloom. The dot stops being this crisp 2-minute of angle circle and turns into a fuzzy, glowing starburst that just obscures your target.
Yeah, it basically covers up what you're trying to shoot.
Right. So by using green, you lower the setting, you eliminate that excessive flare, and you get a much cleaner sight picture.
It is the definition of working smarter, not harder. You're letting your natural physiology do the heavy lifting of contrast detection instead of relying on brute force battery power.
Makes perfect sense.
But of course, the environment is rarely static.
No, it's not. And here's where it gets really interesting. The sun doesn't stay up forever, and we don't only operate in perfect midday lighting.
Oh, definitely not.
Think about transitioning for a second, going from that bright outdoor space into a dim parking garage, or maybe moving through a shaded structure, or just dealing with the creeping shadows of dusk. As the ambient light drops, our visual system undergoes a profound mechanical change.
We leave photopic vision.
Exactly. We leave photopic vision and enter what visual science classifies as mesopic vision.
Mesopic vision is essentially the twilight zone of human eyesight. You are no longer in pure daylight, but you aren't in total darkness either.
You're in between.
Right. In this intermediate lighting, your cones are still firing, they're trying to give you color and detail, but your rods, the photoreceptors responsible for low light vision and motion detection, they're waking up and actively contributing to the image.
And this creates a tug of war in the retina. The Valortec breakdown introduces a really well-documented biological phenomenon here called the Purkinje shift.
Yeah, named after a Czech anatomist from the 1800s.
Right. And this shift explains exactly why colors look so weird at twilight. As illumination drops and the rods start taking on more of the visual workload, the eye's peak sensitivity abandons that 555 nanometer green peak we just talked about.
It physically shifts down the spectrum.
It does. It moves toward shorter wavelengths, settling closer to 507 nanometers, which is more of a blue-green.
And because of that specific biological slide toward the shorter end of the spectrum, longer wavelengths like red are heavily penalized. Yeah, as the shadows lengthen, red loses its apparent brightness to the human eye significantly faster than green.
That is a staggering realization for anyone relying on a red dot for a dusk environment. If you dial in a red dot and a green dot so they look identical in brightness at noon,
And then you leave them at those exact settings until the sun dips below the tree line.
the red dot is going to appear visibly dimmer to you. The green dot holds on to its apparent brightness much longer into the evening.
It explains perfectly why green remains so highly visually assertive in mixed light. Now, the Valortec piece is careful to note that this doesn't automatically crown green as the undisputed king of all low-light shooting.
Fair point.
But if you spend a lot of time in transitional spaces, dawn, dusk, heavily clouded days, or even urban environments with inconsistent street lighting, the mechanics of the Purkinje shift dictate that green is going to offer incredibly reliable, fast visual confirmation.
Now, if green dominates the bright sunlight and holds its ground beautifully through the twilight hours, it begs an obvious question.
Why do we still have red dots?
Exactly. Why hasn't the entire industry just completely abandoned red emitters? Why do companies still manufacture them, and why do top-tier professionals still rely on them?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at what happens when the light drops even further. Once you move past that mesopic twilight and enter true darkness, your visual priorities change entirely. We have to talk about dark adaptation.
And this is where red mounts a massive comeback.
It really does. When you are in a dark environment for an extended period, your eyes painstakingly build up a chemical called rhodopsin.
Often referred to as visual purple.
Right, visual purple, inside the rod cells. It takes roughly 30 to 45 minutes for your eyes to fully dark adapt and let in every possible ounce of ambient light.
That's a long time to build that up.
It is. And the Valortec article brings up clinical visual testing guidance regarding this state. It notes that when dealing with a dark-adapted retina, longer wavelength stimuli like red are significantly less disruptive than shorter wavelengths.
So it's a critical piece of the puzzle for anyone operating at night. Your rod cells are highly sensitive to blue and green light. If you flash a bright green emitter into an eye that has spent 40 minutes adapting to the dark,
You are going to aggressively bleach that rhodopsin.
you will instantly degrade your natural night vision. But red light, because of its longer wavelength, simply does not trigger the rods in the same punishing way.
Yeah.
So to be clear for you listening, this doesn't mean a red dot is somehow magically glowing brighter in a pitch-black room than a green dot.
Not at all.
It means that when you are operating in true darkness, a red emitter acts like a protective filter for your physiology. It allows you to see your aiming point without destroying the natural night vision you need to identify what is hiding in the shadows around your target.
Exactly. If preserving situational awareness in the dark is a top priority for your specific use case, red isn't an outdated choice at all. It's a highly calculated, tactical decision.
But protecting your night vision isn't the only time red flexes its muscles. We also have to consider the background environment itself. The Valortec piece leans heavily into the concept of contrast. specifically in heavily vegetated environments.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah, imagine you are operating in a dense forest, a jungle environment, or even just aiming at an olive drab target backed against a thick line of pine trees.
Contrast is arguably the most important variable in target acquisition. In cognitive psychology and visual design, there's a concept known as figure ground separation.
Figure ground separation.
Right. It's your brain's ability to instantly distinguish an object, the figure, from its surrounding background. If you project a green dot onto a sea of green leaves, your brain has to work fractions of a second longer to separate the two.
It's essentially active camouflage.
It is.
You are forcing your visual cortex to play a game of Where's Waldo with your aiming point. But with a red emitter, the wavelength is entirely distinct from the background foliage,
Yeah, the red violently contrasts against the green backdrop.
ensuring that the dot visually pops out from the environmental noise. Even if green is theoretically more luminous to the human eye in daylight, red will often be much faster to acquire in the woods, simply because of that extreme color contrast.
It perfectly illustrates why this debate can never be settled in a vacuum. You cannot just look at a biological sensitivity chart and declare a winner.
Right.
The choice always depends on the visual scene as a whole and whether the tool allows you to achieve instant figure ground separation in your specific environment.
That brings us to the most unpredictable environment of all, and that is the inside of your own head.
Yeah, this is where it gets really personal.
It was one of the most eye-opening sections of the Velour Tech breakdown. The absolute biggest mistake you can make when picking out an optic is assuming that your eyes process light exactly the same way your buddy's eyes do.
It's a trap we all fall into. We assume human vision is standardized, but the physics of how light travels through the biological lens of your eye is highly individualized, and it perfectly explains the endless arguments you hear at the range.
I know you've experienced this. You buy a brand new red dot, you mount it, you look through the glass, and the dot looks like a blurry, smeared mess.
Yeah, you think the optic is broken.
Exactly. So you hand the rifle to your buddy, he looks through it, and he says, "What are you talking about? It looks perfectly crisp to me."
Right.
Herfel's article completely validates both of those experiences by diving into the physics of longitudinal chromatic aberration.
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just a matter of opinion. It is hard optical physics. When light passes through a lens, whether it's the glass objective lens of the optic or the biological lens of your eye, different wavelengths do not bend at the exact same angle.
They travel at different speeds.
Exactly. Red light and green light travel at slightly different speeds through that medium. Because of this, they actually focus at slightly different depths inside the human eye.
Meaning they aren't landing on the exact same focal plane on your retina. Red focuses slightly further back, while green focuses a bit shorter. And because they land at different microscopic depths, your individual eye might physically struggle to resolve one color while perfectly resolving the other.
Precisely. Your buddy isn't lying when he says the red dot is perfectly crisp, and you aren't crazy when you say it looks like a blurry splatter. Your unique corneal structure and lens density are just interacting with that specific wavelength differently.
And this individual variance gets drastically amplified when we introduce common medical conditions, particularly astigmatism.
Oh, astigmatism changes everything.
It really does. For anyone who has managed to avoid the eye doctor, an astigmatism means your cornea isn't perfectly round like a basketball. It is slightly oblong, shaped more like a football. When you take a highly concentrated point of light, like an LED, reflecting off a piece of glass, and pass it through a football-shaped cornea, that light scatters.
And the clinical term for that scattering involves higher-order aberrations. But practically speaking, it means the crisp aiming dot turns into a massive starburst, or maybe a comet with a tail, or a cluster of grapes.
Yeah, a cluster of grapes is a common one.
Because of the chromatic aberration we just discussed. An eye with an astigmatism might heavily distort a red wavelength into an unusable smear, but render a green wavelength with minimal distortion. Or, depending on the axis of the astigmatism, the exact opposite might occur.
It makes it crystal clear that if you have an astigmatism, you cannot just buy an optic based on an internet recommendation or a biological sensitivity chart. You have to physically look through both the red and green versions at the store.
Because the optimal choice is strictly dictated by which wavelength your unique eye renders the most cleanly.
Yeah. An astigmatism is just one physical variable. The Velour Tech source also brings up color vision deficiency, specifically congenital red-green color blindness. This is a massive demographic that just gets overlooked in this debate.
The numbers Herfel cites are significant. Because it's an X chromosome-linked trait, congenital color vision deficiency affects roughly 8% of males and about 0.5% of females.
So if you are standing in a room with 12 guys, odds are one of them has some level of red-green color blindness.
Statistically, yes.
For that demographic, how does this change the calculus of choosing an optic?
Well, if you have this specific deficiency, your retina simply lacks the standard distribution of functioning cone cells needed to process red efficiently. A red emitter is going to appear significantly muted or washed out.
It doesn't command your attention.
Exactly, which means it will be drastically slower to pick up during a rapid presentation of the firearm.
So for that 8% of the male population, the entire internet debate is completely moot. Choosing a green dot isn't about chasing a tactical trend or trying to optimize daylight photopic vision. It is a sheer functional necessity just to be able to use the tool as intended.
Absolutely. If your biological hardware cannot efficiently process red, green is the only accessible choice that guarantees rapid target acquisition.
All right. We have spent a significant amount of time deep in the biology. We covered how the retina processes light, how the focal planes shift, and how the shape of the cornea dictates clarity. But if we are going to look at the whole picture, we have to look at the hardware powering that dot. Let's pivot to the engineering side, specifically the age-old argument about battery life.
Ah, the classic hardware debate. You hear it everywhere. Red dots will run for 5 years, but green dots will eat your batteries alive mid-range trip.
Right. People treat it as an absolute law of physics. But the Valortech breakdown actually explains the science behind that claim. It introduces a concept from semiconductor manufacturing known as the green gap.
A green gap.
Yeah. To understand this, we have to remember what an LED actually is. It's a light-emitting diode. You are pushing electrical current across a microscopic gap in a semiconductor material, and as the electrons move across that gap, they release energy in the form of photons light.
And historically, generating those specific photons in the green wavelength has been an engineering nightmare. In the specific material systems used to build these diodes, often indium gallium nitride researchers found it incredibly difficult to achieve high-efficiency light emission in the green region of the spectrum compared to red or blue.
Meaning the underlying technology required to make a diode glow true green inherently demands more electrical current to achieve the same visual output as making one glow red.
Right.
So the green gap is a very real drop in semiconductor efficiency.
It is a documented historical hurdle. Because early green LEDs suffered from lower efficiency, they drew more power, which directly resulted in those notoriously short battery lifespans that early adopters complained about.
But Herfel provides a crucial reality check here. While the green gap explains the historical struggle, modern engineering has thrown a lot of money and brainpower at solving it.
Yes, they have.
You cannot just blindly assume that every red optic on the market today will outlast every green optic.
That is a vital distinction. The overall runtime of an optic doesn't just depend on the bare diode. It is dictated by the entire system design. Modern manufacturers use advanced circuitry to mitigate the green gap. For instance, many premium optics utilize pulse width modulation.
Pulse width modulation is fascinating. Instead of leaving the LED turned on constantly, the optic circuitry actually flashes the diode on and off thousands of times a second.
It happens so incredibly fast that your human eye perceives it as a solid, continuous dot.
Right, but because the diode is technically turned off for half of that second, the battery life is drastically extended.
Exactly. When you combine efficient power management systems like pulse width modulation with highly optimized modern circuit boards, high-end green optics can now offer battery life measured in tens of thousands of hours. They completely rival their red counterparts.
So you have to evaluate the battery life model by model, reading the specific manufacturer's specifications for that unit rather than dismissing green entirely based on a decades-old assumption about diode efficiency. Okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the 555 nanometer peak of daylight photopic vision, then the shifting sands of the mesopic Purkinje shift. We looked at how red preserves rhodopsin for dark adaptation and creates aggressive figure ground separation against foliage.
We dove into the individualized physics of chromatic aberration and astigmatism.
And finally looked at how modern engineering uses pulse width modulation to bridge the green gap. So what does this all mean? How do we distill all of this complex science into an actionable takeaway for you listening?
The most scientifically honest conclusion you can draw from the Valortech breakdown is that there's no universal winner. The best color is entirely conditional.
Let's summarize it impartially based on the data. If your primary environment demands maximum raw visual acquisition speed in bright daylight.
Or if you frequently transition through mixed lighting, like parking garages and dusk environments.
The biological science of photopic and mesopic vision strongly points to green. It simply leverages the natural peak sensitivities of the human eye far better than red.
Conversely, if your operational priorities dictate strict preservation of your natural night vision, or if your environment is heavily dominated by green foliage, where you desperately need that contrasting figure-ground separation.
Red is an incredibly defensible, highly tactical choice. Furthermore, if your individual cornea has an astigmatism that happens to render the longer red wavelength more cleanly, then red is functionally superior for your specific anatomy.
It fundamentally changes how you look at gear, doesn't it? You're no longer guessing or trusting a random forum post.
No,
You are actively evaluating your primary lighting environment, your specific background terrain, and the unique physical reality of your own eyes to make an informed scientific decision.
it absolutely empowers the user.
It does.
Yeah.
And this raises an important question, something really fascinating to think about as we wrap up. Given everything we've just learned about how drastically lighting and backgrounds change our visual needs, could the future of optic engineering bypass this debate entirely?
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Right. Imagine a smart optic that doesn't force you to choose red or green at the store, but instead features a dynamic LED system that actively monitors ambient light and background color, instantly shifting its own wavelength to give your unique eyes the ultimate contrast in real time.
I love that. A piece of gear that actually adapts to the biology and the environment simultaneously instead of making you compromise.
Right.
It's the perfect provocative thought to leave you with today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been an absolute blast breaking down the hard science behind the glass counter debate. Remember, whatever equipment you choose to bolt to your slide, always keep questioning the why behind the tools you use. Stay curious, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.